And we now indeed move over to the fourth and final presentation of this panel. We have been talking intensively about Nahum Goldman, and of course in the presence of such a lot of very important members of the Claims Conference, I do not dare to question this. He undoubtedly played an important role, but as we say in a wonderful German quote, and I fear I can't translate it, so this is only for the Germans, zu viel Weihrauch schwärzt die Heiligen. I mean, if you I can't translate it. I'll do it later if you want to have it translated. I think it is very important to look at another person, and I'm sure that you will also introduce him to us, Felix Chenard, whom the sober Atlatus of Adenauer, Walter Hallstein, praised almost enthusiastically. No better man than Dr. Chenard could have been chosen to hold the leading position in the Israeli mission in Germany. Chenard, he added, made a name for himself in West Germany, and the smooth implementation of the agreement was to a considerable degree due to Dr. Chenard's special talent. After all, he managed to ensure that the door of the Chancellor, who himself always made sure that the implementation of the agreement, and I think that's also an important point, went smoothly, was always open for him. Early on, the mission in Cologne was, after all, more than just the control station for monitoring compliance with the agreement. At least, I hope that Irit will not completely contradict that now. In order to introduce her, I will also reveal something about Irit that is not in the biography that we received in the conference folders. Irit completed her master's degree, summa cum laude, in modern German and European studies at the University of Haifa. Her master thesis entitled Contact but No Established Relations, the Israeli Consulate in Munich between Israel and Germany, 1948 to 1953. And I think this, of course, relates to her issue today. She received the Graduate Studies Dienst Prize for Outstanding Master Thesis. I lost all my Hebrew, but I guess I can still say Kol HaKavod. Irit, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for this introduction, surprising introduction also in some other parts that I didn't mention, and also for the organizers and Professor Stauber, and for the I'm very honored and happy to be here in this important and interesting conference. And this is okay? Okay, perfect. And as the wonderful lecturers before me discussed international and national levels of the signing of the agreement and its implementation, and also economic and monetary perspectives, in my talk today, I would like to add another layer to this analysis. And this would be a more personal level, of a more, let's say, emotional, personal level that would describe how the work of the people who were sent, who were there in Germany were there at the beginning of the 50s and throughout the 50s and beginning of 60s to implement this agreement. And with no further ado, then I will start my lecture. So on May 4, 1953, dozens of Israeli emissaries made their way to Cologne's Jewish community building on 85 Ottostrasse, which from this date on served as the first seat of the Israeli Purchasing Mission, also called Israel Mission, in the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and hereinafter Germany. From these offices, the representative of the State of Israel were responsible for implementing the Reparations Agreement, purchasing German goods according to the needs of the Israeli economy and dispatching them to Israel. While the Israeli mission's members operated to dispatch German goods to Israel, their own dispatchment to Cologne wasn't their first encounter with Germany. The Israeli envoys were natives of the German-speaking regions. They had been educated in German schools and universities and gained professional work experience in German banks and economic firms until they were forced to flee and immigrate to Mandatory Palestine, following the rise of Nazism to power. In the 1950s, they returned to their place of origin as representatives of the State of Israel. On the work of the Israeli-German Jewish delegates in Germany, we can learn from a newspaper article published in February 1954 in the Maariv newspaper titled, "This is How the Shilumim Machine Works." It was written by a special correspondent, Aleph Avigdor, who sought to present to the Israeli reader the task of fulfilling the reparations agreement, and I quote, "3 cars raced at breakneck speed along the famous Autobahn in the direction of Bonn, the capital of West Germany. At the sound of the horns, all the other drivers lined up in a typical German fashion to the right side of the shiny asphalt road." End of quote. The cars, it was written, were making their way to the building of the West German Ministry of Economic, which served as headquarters of the German Army's artillery battalion during those days, that is, during the time of Nazi Germany. Upon their arrival, the Israeli envoys, who according to the author belonged to the elite of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the stars of the Ministry of Finance, walked towards the meeting room, where the German representatives were already waiting. One was described, and I quote, as a tall, blonde, pure Aryan type. Another was a young Sudeten German from Czechoslovakia, and the third was a fighter for democracy and a resident of the concentration camp during Hitler's time. Each man in his position and the burden of his past. End of quote. From there, as explained in the newspaper article, the Israeli envoys made their way back to the mission's house in Cologne, where they toiled the task of the purchasing at all hours of the day and until late at night. And I quote again, "Work is being done in most of the rooms. The street is tired. The temporary home is not attractive. Here, inside the office, the Israeli finds his place in Germany." End of quote. This description of the work illustrates the separation between the Israeli envoys and the German sphere. Not in their daily lives and not with their German colleagues. Moreover, it highlights the difference between the two sides. The Israeli envoys were presented as highly competent professional representatives representing the State of Israel and safeguarding its economic interests in Germany. The Germans, on the other hand, were described by their typical German traits as representing 3 typical strata of the population in West Germany in the early 1950s. Last but not least, it also depicted the difficult and arduous task of the Israeli emissaries, highlighting their personal sacrifice during their service in Germany, only a few years after the Holocaust. What's most interesting about this newspaper article is that a perusal of the Israeli purchasing missions folders in the Israeli State Archives reveals that the article was in fact written by a member of the purchasing company, an Israeli governmental company that was established for the realization of the agreement, and not by the newspaper's special correspondent. In other words, this was a profile article intended to portray the separation, lack of contacts, and hardships of the Israeli emissaries during their service of implementing the agreement. This raises different questions as to why this was the image that was presented. Why was the background of the Israeli envoys not presented while that of their German colleagues was? Was it possible to maintain a lack of content? And if not, what mediated the contact between Germans and Israelis a few years after the Holocaust? In my lecture today, I will seek to answer these questions. The lecture's objective is to examine the work of the mission's members in 2 perspectives. The first, the formation of early ties between Israel and Germany concerning the agreement in the absence of official diplomatic relations, and the second, the way the German Jewish heritage of the emissaries was reflected in this endeavor. The lecturer argues that this dual point of view, moving between the personal and the professional, would reveal that the fulfillment of the agreement by the delegation members involved a dual occupation, dealing with the material baggage, purchasing the goods, and dealing with the baggage of the past, the personal and the collective. The lecture will discuss the complexity involved in dealing with both aspects and will show that the German Jewish heritage was a means of mediation, facilitating various encounters between the sides. The first part of the lecture will present central aspects in establishing the mission, leading me to discuss the launch of operations in Germany. I will then present a case study of the construction of German ships for the Israeli Merchant Navy and examine the symbolic meaning of those ships for Germany, Israel, and the other relations between them. About half a year after the signing of the Reparations Agreement, Israeli envoys gathered in the Israel mission offices in Cologne, the city that from now on would serve for several years as their temporary home during their service of the State of Israel in Germany. The fact that the mission's envoys would need to copy their lives from all places to Germany in order to deal with the reparations was feared by the mission's head, Felix Eliezer Shen'ar, formerly Felix Schneebalg, to be a major hardship in establishing the mission. When he himself was offered in May 1951 to head the Department of Compensation from Germany in the Foreign Office, he pondered for several days until he responded affirmatively. Despite his positive response, he knew that in carrying out the task he had undertaken, I quote, "It would not be possible to reconcile the emotions and feelings on the one hand and the matter-of-fact needs on the other." End of quote. This demand for compensation payments a few years after the Holocaust was not only a controversial issue, but it forced Shen'ar to return to previous places of his life from which he had to flee. He was born in Stuttgart in 1905, studied at the universities of Tübingen, Frankfurt, and Heidelberg, where he qualified as a doctor of law and worked as an economic advisor and trustee of large companies in Berlin. The anti-Semitic events he had experienced upon the rise of Nazism to power led him to immigrate to Mandatory Palestine in 1935, and I quote, "disgusted by the transformation of people who had yesterday still been human beings." End of quote. Despite Shen'ar's apprehension, as early as mid-October 1952, only 1 month after the signing of the agreement, about 3,000 applications had been submitted for staffing the mission. A perusal of application letters reveals that the common denominator for the applicants for service of the State of Israel in Germany was their early acquaintance with the German space. The applicants had been born in Germany and had acquired the German language in infancy. Their letters of candidacy were written in Hebrew or German. It is possible that the applicants wrote in German to prove their proficiency in a language that was necessary for the day-to-day work in Germany. However, this may be due to the simple fact that their command of the German language was better than their command of the Hebrew language, since they had studied in German universities and had made their first professional steps in the German trade market in the 1920s and 1930s, and in the implementation of the transfer agreement signed between the Jewish Yishuv in Mandatory Palestine and the Nazi authorities. If so, submitting candidacy to the ranks of the future delegation would have brought some of the candidates together with the spaces of their previous lives. The process of returning to Germany involved not only crossing the physical border between Israel and Germany, but also the personal, emotional process that historian Marita Kraus called the settlement of the borders in the heart. The encounter of the Israeli emissaries with their place of birth forced them to face a dual difficulty. The first was the change that had taken place in the German space, the local population and the sites of their home and childhood. The tangible re-encounter of the Israeli emissaries with their previous life space had not disappeared from the eyes of their German colleagues, as was reflected in a report made by a member of the Berlin municipality to the German Foreign Ministry following a visit of Shen'ar and other delegates to West Berlin in July 1953. The letter, so it was stated, came to discuss the purchase of goods from West Berlin's industrial products to support the city's developing economy. And since the delegates had not been in Berlin for many years, it was reported, they were greatly impressed by the changes that had taken place in the city and its reconstruction efforts. The second difficulty was the return to Germany as representative of a country that had imposed boycott measures on the German state and culture. Their willingness to return to Germany met with harsh criticism in Israel. For example, in mid-April 1953, 2 weeks before the delegation's intended establishment in Germany, the ruling party Mapai convened to discuss the implementation of the agreement. At the meeting, claims were heard that the delegation emissaries were not suitable for the position in terms of their values, and that they might cross political and moral boundaries in their relations with Germany. That is, make friends with the Germans. It is possible that the skepticism expressed towards the delegation members was rooted years earlier in the attitude of the people of the Jewish Yeshuv in Mandatory Palestine towards the German Jews. The latter's refusal to give up their culture and uniqueness led to the Yeshuv veterans to feel that they were so deeply rooted in their culture of a region, and therefore did not intend to take root in their new land, but rather to settle in it until they could return to their homes. So the delegates requested not to have any social contact with the Germans. But whether this was possible on the private personal level, and we can discuss this later, it soon became clear that this was not possible on the professional level. The task of the purchase of the goods required the delegation members to be in a daily contact with German suppliers and factories, request prices, offers, and negotiate prices. By virtue of these tasks, the delegation's employees visited German factories to examine and test the German goods that were about to be sent to Israel. A tour of this type could last for several hours, so in most cases, the German host invited the Israeli guests to lunch together with them. Refusing this invitation could have harmed the German hosts and hindered the completion of the mission. Therefore, the Israeli representative could not help but reply positively. "There is nothing more difficult," said Chen-Ar, and I quote, "than performing a role of this scope and content and remaining as if out of touch with the reality." End of quote. The daily professional encounter also turned into a personal encounter. An example can be reflected through the ties between Chen-Ar and Karl Hermann Müller-Graf, head of the German delegation to the mixed committees, whose role was to deal with all questions arising from the implementation of the agreement. Müller-Graf's professional experience regarding Jewish property began as early as the 1930s as part of his work in the Reich's Ministry of Economics. He devotedly supported the transfer agreement, and his support for saving Jewish property even led to his dismissal and transfer to the Trade Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 1946, he published a book under a pen name that dealt with the rise of the Nazis to power and their crimes. Less than half a year after the mission's arrival in Cologne, the professional meetings between Chen-Ar and Müller-Graf, which took place in the offices of the Mixed Committee in Frankfurt, were already moved to the private space when Müller-Graf was invited to the former's home. The transfer of the meetings from the public professional space to the personal private space made it possible to expand the topics of conversation between the two. During dinner, they talked extensively about Müller-Graf's book and about the possibility of the latter publishing a summary of his book for the Israeli audience. Chen-Ar assumed that this would bring to the public's attention, and I quote, "that among these people there are also exceptional ones." End of quote. Considering the feelings that accompanied Chen-Ar's fleeing from Germany, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, one can only ponder whether it was an attempt to prove to himself and others that among the Germans, the people to whom he also belonged, there were people who acted differently. The lack of trust expressed in Israel against the delegation members who voluntarily returned to Germany and worked mutually with German firms also reflected to some extent to the lack of trust in the Bonn government. For example, at the end of 1953, after the signing of the contract between the mission and Stückeln shipyard over order number 833, the first ship to be built for the Israeli National Shipping Company, ZIM, the company requested that if the ship was not made available to them, quote, due to an obstacle caused by the German government because of its political relations with the State of Israel, include a relationship relating to the implementation of the Reparations agreement, we will be freed from any obligation we have taken upon ourselves. End of quote. Despite the lack of confidence in Germany's will to realize the agreement, the ship's construction was completed on time, and in the second half of July 1954, a government meeting convened in Jerusalem to discuss the consequences of launching the German ship to Israel on Jewish-German relations. Was it a joyous event for the Germans, the ship's constructors, or for the Jews, the ship's recipients? The main motive for dealing with this rooted in a maritime tradition that developed in the last decade of the 19th century, according to which, when a ship is launched, a local woman smashes a bottle of alcohol on the side of the ship as a symbol of luck and a safe voyage. Therefore, the government members were to discuss who would launch the lowering of the ship into the water, the wife of the head of the Israeli delegation, Ilse Shen'ar, or a German woman. The position that was heard at the meeting demanded a separation between the two joyous events, as Jewish celebrations could not take place in Germany. Shen'ar's view over the ship's launching ceremony in Hamburg reveals that the delivery of the first ship built by Reparations money was a Jewish and a German celebration. The event was attended by representatives of the mission, representatives of the German Foreign Ministry, representatives of the Hamburg Senate, journalists, and community members of the local Jewish community. Even though the woman who was chosen to smash the bottle of alcohol on the side of the ship was German, she quoted a sentence from the Wayfarer's Prayer in Hebrew, to reach her destination in life, joy, and peace. At 4:40 in the afternoon, at the exact scheduled lunchtime, the ship was lowered into the water. The precise adherence to schedule aroused the great astonishment of Shen'ar, who expressed appreciation and respect for the punctuality of the German organizers. His speech, which was delivered in German, shows that in his eyes the ship's launching was a festive event common to both countries and based on a German-Jewish past relations. He emphasized the importance of the Reparations Agreement for trade relations of the State of Israel with the world in general, and with Germany in particular. The ship was designed to transport 75,000 boxes of citrus fruits, the largest export of the State of Israel. Just a few months before, he pointed out, in December 1953, the marketing of Israeli citrus fruits to Germany was resumed. And this was enabled due to the well-known quality of Jaffa oranges from the period before World War II, reflecting the roots of commercial ties between Germany, the Jewish Yishuv, and German Jewry throughout the 20s and 30s. Shen'ar's words, it seems, were somewhat of a mediating voice between the Israeli position that in the first half of the 1950s was not yet ripe for having political relations with Germany, and the latter which was that had interest in these relations. His words did not express an explicit statement about deepening political ties between the two countries, most likely to comply with the official Israeli position. But as someone who had lived in Germany and was attentive to the German desire for closer relations, his words included a statement about deepening commercial ties between the countries as a kind of a first step of reapproachment. Evidence of this can be seen in a personal letter sent by a member of the German Foreign Ministry, Avraham Frohwein, to Shen'ar, shortly after the ceremony, in which he stated that, and I quote, "Ships are a symbol of the relationship, and I hope that the Dagan, the first ship that was launched to Israel, and the additional ship that will be delivered as part of the reparations agreement will bridge not just the physical distance between our two countries." And it seems that the reparation ships and the reparations envoys did bridge the physical and symbolic distance. Several months afterwards, they were to facilitate the arrival of German naval experts to Israel, and shortly afterwards, Israeli and German seamen were to meet and work together. The demand for separation between Jews and Germans is well dissolved, as can be seen by the festive ceremony at the Deutsche Werft shipyard in October 1956 for the launch of the reparations ship Theodor Herzl. Shen'ar's wife was now chosen to smash the bottle of alcohol on the side of the ship, thus dissolving the distinction between a Jewish and a German joyous event. The German Chancellor and Shen'ar also stood side by side. Even though the two had previously met, This meeting in the port of Hamburg was special because it did not take place behind closed doors, but up front in public. The speech given by William Schulz, head of the Deutsche Wert shipyard, blurred the separation between the two sides by emphasizing the symbolic significance of this event. It was the first passenger ship built in Germany after World War II that had the honor to be built for Israel. Shenar's talk, which was given in German, emphasized the way in which the two joys, the Jewish and the German, were intertwined. This ship, he said, was going to carry on board people from all over the world who wanted to take part in the process of establishing the old new homeland. His choice of the term old new homeland was surely not accidental, but intended to allow the continuation of his speech, which reviewed the Zionist activity of Theodor Herzl in the German space, where the roots of the Zionist enterprise had been planted. Still, one cannot refrain from asking why he chose the word homeland and not Heimat and not the word land that appeared in Herzl's book Alt Neuland, and whether this was to reflect his attachment to the two homelands, the one from which he was expelled and the one into which he was absorbed. If we return now to the newspaper article with which I had opened this lecture, it becomes clear that presenting the separation, hardships, and sacrifice of the mission members during their service was intended. While their arrival in Germany did evoke hardships for the delegates, the separation between the Israeli-German Jews emissaries and the German sphere was impossible. The wish to highlight the separation between the two sides stemmed from the Israeli objection against Germany, the Reparations Agreement, and the willingness of the German Jews to operate in Germany. While their German Jewish heritage was perceived in Israel as being a source of lack of trust, in practice it served as a mediator between Israel and Germany, between the material and the emotional, and between the past and the present, by shaping the realization of the agreement in several ways. The natives of the German-speaking region responded positively to the possibility of returning to their homeland as representative of the State of Israel, and in their letters of candidacy, they emphasized their belonging to the German region. Upon their arrival in Germany, the conceptual encounter turned into a tangible re-encounter with the places where they were born, raised, and educated. The beginning of their work evoked a professional encounter. They had already acquired the skills in German companies and facilitated the work in a common language, German, which would make their work more efficient. The ongoing professional contact also became a personal encounter when the parties met for joint meals, sometimes also in personal spaces. The attentiveness of the head of the mission to the German discourse mediated the difference between the two countries regarding the significance of the realization of the Reparations Agreement on German-Jewish relations as reflected in the ceremonies of launching the reparations ships. To some extent, the voyage of the German-built ships to Israel, where they would contribute to the development of the new state, reflected the voyage of the German-born Israeli envoys between the two spaces. Both the reparations good and the reparations delegates had two layers of belonging that continue to exist side by side. Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking this very personal and emotional perspective. For good reasons, the history of emotions is on the rise because it has obvious relevance and is also in a way helping to avoid the trap of looking at historic events out of the perspective or through the lenses of the events in that time, but through the lenses of current developments. And that's, I think, a progressing illness that we have to fight. So I thought that was a rather good contribution to this history of emotions. And when you did talk about the personal relations, I thought about the fact that actually also during the negotiations, Shina and Küster found out that they attended the same school. And that also kind of break the ice between the two. Or broke the ice between the two, forgive my English. So I think this is very important. And one last mentioning about Chinna, most of you might know, is that Chinna was actually the one who gave the information of Fritz Bauer to the Mossad about the whereabouts of Eichmann. And I think this is also, again, highlighting the relevance of Chinna.